the animals of the planet on our planet in real life are so absolutely incredible. Their attributes, the things that they're capable of, basically the sky's the limit, I feel like, when it comes to creatures able to do incredible things.
Welcome to First Fridays. I'm Joel Keyson. I'm a program manager here at the Natural History Museum. We all ready to nerd out? All right, we're really happy for you to be here. A couple of things. Our theme for this season is fandoms and fantasy. We are celebrating the intersection of pop culture fandom and the work and collection of NHM. And part of that work is bringing you folks here to NHM so we can not only share our stories together, but also be part of each other's stories and to celebrate our rich and intersecting communities. So thank you all for being here. And special thank you to our media sponsors, KCRW, and our event partner, I Am Sound, for making help this series a success. We'd also like to thank our community partner, Pro Bono ASL, for providing interpretation for this evening's discussion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce once again our host and moderator for First Fridays this season, neuroscientist and science communicator, Dr. Yewande Pierce. Enjoy.
Welcome to First Fridays, everyone. It's so good to see you back for our season theme. This month, we're going to be exploring witches, wizards, and magical powers. Again, it's great to see people in costume. We've got a great discussion, I think, in store for us tonight. And what we're going to be exploring is really the magical world of witches, wizards, and fantastical creatures with experts on creature making. So how closely do these made-up creatures resemble their natural counterparts? And how do creators find inspiration in real life when building worlds populated with magical beasts and outworldly beings? They're some of the questions that we're going to get to the heart of tonight. So our guests this evening are experts in the world of creature making and fantasy building. We have the pleasure to be joined by first Dr. Stuart Samida, a biologist. Round of applause. A biologist and paleontologist working out of CSU San Bernardino. He has excavated fossils in the US and Europe and has acted as an anatomical consultant on over 50 films, actually 70, we talked about this before, even more impressive, involving animation and visual effects, as well as on video games and theme park rides. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
We also have Jordi Schall, who has brought these incredible models, which we'll get to, who has been in the fantasy art and sculpture field for nearly 40 years, lending his talents to such diverse film projects as Avatar, Edward Scissorhands, Galaxy Quest, it's a good one. Also, The Mist, which I saw recently, which is an incredible film if you haven't seen it. Out of his Chatsworth, California studio, Schall creates his own high-end art collectibles and masks, as well as designs film, television, and video games. He has been teaching the art of creature and character design out of his facility, abroad and online, for nearly 30 years as well. Considered among the best monster men in the business, Schall is proud to be affiliated with the Natural History Museum and the opportunity to share his craft with a wider group of people. Welcome. Okay, so let's get into our discussion tonight. I'm going to start with maybe an obvious question, but I think it's a fun one, which is, what is your favorite fantastical creature of all time? Magical, witchy, wizardy, or otherwise. I'd say mine is, if anyone's interested, the Labyrinth, Ludo. I know, he's so adorable. Jordi, what would be your answer?
I grew up with so many influences and so many fantastic images I saw on screen, but I think the one that is the most convincing to me, the one that changed design forever, and the one that I still look at and go, that's just brilliant is the creatures from the movie Alien.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's a pretty good one.
How do you follow that up?
So the creatures from Alien is taken. Dr. Sumida, what would be your answer?
I remember being impressively scared to death the first time I saw those, in a good way. Sorry. So I'm going to have to come up with a different perspective on that. I'll flip it on its head and say dragons, because as a biologist, to me, dragons are things that we build out of pieces we already know. And you might think that I'm going to say the dragons from Game of Thrones, but I'm not. I'm going to say the dragons from Reign of Fire and How to Train Your Dragon.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Fans. Both great answers. So we'll come back to that. But I guess one of the things that's most fascinating about both of you is that you occupy this really unique intersection between art and science. So I'd be really curious to start off with just to understand a little bit about how you found yourself in this particular space and what synergy you see between science and art in the context of creature creation. George, do you?
Well, I think, one of the things about creature design that you're always keeping in mind is it believable? And then you have to balance that with, is it cool? So it can't just be cool looking, or else you end up with something that is cool but doesn't necessarily make sense.
Right.
So, obviously you have to, the first consideration is always anatomy and inventing new anatomical structures and coming up with ways of reimagining anatomies that we're familiar with on this planet to seem alien or bizarre. Because the animals of the planet, on our planet, in real life, are so absolutely incredible. And I'm not just talking about the pageantry of color and form and, jellyfish and all this sort of thing, but their attributes, the things that they're capable of, basically the sky's the limit, I feel like, when it comes to creatures able to do incredible things.
Finding yourself in that space, were you equally inspired by the science growing up, or making the creatures and then understanding that the science was so integral to that process?
I'm pretty, I think initially, I was pretty unsophisticated. I was just a kid who liked monster movies.
Right.
And that, as I got older and became better at this work, I became more fascinated with anatomy and animalia and all that sort of thing. But I've always, like so many people in this world, I love animals. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly thrilling to be giving this talk in this hall with all these gorgeous. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I used to go to the museum in Philadelphia, the Natural History Museum there, and look at the dioramas, just absolutely knocked out. And this is no different. I'm always enthralled by this.
It's a perfect setting for that. And someone who would know a lot about this would be Stuart. How did you find, because you actually really do lean into that space, your interest in education and being in film as well.
I'm very fortunate in that regard. And one of the things, my day job is I teach human anatomy and animal anatomy and to pre-meds and nurses and folks like that. And I dig up fossils. But one of the things that we find, as you just heard, is that there's so much inspiration in the world that's right around us. Especially if you go from the microscopic level up, there is some crazy weird stuff out there. And so obviously you can take things from interesting combinations of them, but my entry into this was being a scientist and being a biologist, and the very first project I ever worked on was before many of the when we're born, was Beauty and the Beast, when they said, we need to know what a carnivore like a wolf and an herbivore like a horse, how they move. And they said, well, did you ever talk to a biologist? And a friend of mine said, I know one. And so it was really rooted in the science. But then as we come to amazing, magical, and mythical creatures, not exclusively, but there's often inspiration in things that we already know, as you just heard from the biology or the anatomy. So have I ever dissected a dragon? No. But have I dissected a lizard? And have I dissected a bat? And have I studied a pterosaur? Well, yes. And then the question is, how do we sew those together so that we believe they live in the universe you're seeing on screen?
And create something homogenous from several different parts, which
Yeah.
is something that I know Jordan
And
talk about
that's
a lot.
where creativity meets the part where you just mentioned. It's got to be believable too.
And just to lean into that example about Beauty, the first Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah,
What is
right.
what is Beast?
Okay, to give credit where credit's due. The Beast was designed by an animator named Glenn Keane, who's considered one of the finest animators of his generation. And Glenn based the Beast, at least as originally conceived, as sort of having the head of a buffalo and the body of a bear, but hands that could manipulate things. The feet are a bit more digitigrade, like a dog. And then he looked at the fur of many, many different things, and he made the upper body massive, but he's only 4 heads high. He's got a huge head. And
that's true.
Yeah, you think about that? All of
Completely out of
us up
proportion.
here, we're about 8 heads high, so we look normal. Babies
I'm
are,
probably 3.
okay, well, babies are, 3 or 4 or 5 heads high. So he's terrifying and cute all at the same time. Very
Disarming.
clever, very. So
Part
the
of the
art once
storytelling.
again comes together with the science to make you believe.
So much of that is subconscious, actually. So you find things believable without dissecting it. So going to a movie with either one of you, I'm sure it's an interesting experience. But
My sons hate going to the movies with me, so.
But we'll get into that later on in the conversation. So we've touched a little bit on process. So I would love to talk a little bit about that. So, I mean, the end result is ultimately what does capture our attention. But I think that there's something particularly fascinating about process in this conversation. And as a paleontologist, trying to understand the evolutionary origin of existing life forms when we were not present, that's obviously a process in itself. And then as an artist creating fictional life forms, Georgie, can you talk a little bit about your process using a few examples of, or like maybe a couple of how that can sort of diverge?
Are you asking what the process is like?
Yeah, your
when I-
own process. So you said you were a fan of monsters. So do you start with complete imagination and then work in some of the science or other processes into that, or what do you start with on a project?
If I'm working for a client, obviously the goal is to meet their needs. So the first thing you do on a film or a TV show or something is you read the script.
Yeah.
And it's very important, I think, to come up with creatures and characters that fit the tone of the script. You wouldn't have a creature from the 7th voyage of Sinbad in Ghostbusters. You know what I mean? They're very different feels and moods. So you want to read the script, get a feel for the tone of the script, and have a conversation with the producer and director, hopefully just the producer or director, and nail down what they're kind of thinking. Usually the worst brief is, I want something no one's ever seen before. That's what they all say, and you always end up with something everybody's seen before.
I've noticed.
So then I start off with drawings, miniature sculptures like maquettes. I don't know if, I didn't know if they were going to show that, but there are, sculptures like the miniatures there, and they can help get a conversation started. And then from there, it kind of like, okay, I like that. Let's make the eyes a little bigger. Let's make the neck a little longer. Let's make the legs a little shorter. And you have ET. So there you go.
So these guys over there on this table, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about them later, but so maybe you could talk about the one in the middle. Is that one of...
Which one is this?
So the little guy in the third one in.
Okay.
Bending over.
Okay, the trilateral legs. That creature is something of my own design. I mean, like I said, by contrast, when I'm working for myself, when I just want to create something cool, it usually kind of starts as an inspiration. I get an idea, and I think that would be really interesting. That would be an interesting challenge, and I'll go forth from there, usually just kind of creating as I go.
Right.
And all of the things on that table are examples of just my own stuff. They're not for any particular film or show or anything. They're just things I wanted to do. So I think that my creativity is at its best when I'm just left to my own devices, when I'm just doing my own thing.
And you can free flow with that. As you can see, they're incredible. Dr. Sumida, I know that you've been in many rooms early on in exciting film processes. Like, for example, Life of Pi is one of the films that you worked on. Could you talk a little bit about what process was like there?
Yes, but before I do, I want to reiterate something that you just heard. You remember what was the first thing he said? I draw. Okay? I can tell you that the most common question I get is, so how can I get into the film and animation business? And I say, there's so many facets to it right now that there's room for people of all sorts of different talents depending on what your talent is, from artistic to computer savvy. But every artist I know draws. Every artist I know has a little notebook that they scribble ideas down in. So the first thing you want to do is, if you like this stuff, you should always be drawing. And as an anatomist, as someone who teaches anatomy, we're constantly visualizing the things that we do. So to answer your question now, there are different categories of the things we do, as you just heard. Again, I'm so happy to be following you, actually, as opposed to going in before you. So sometimes you get something very realistic that has to act in a realistic fashion, like Life of Pi. Sometimes you get something very realistic that has to act cartoony, like we know mice don't talk, but if they did, okay? Sometimes you get something very cartoony, like Scooby-Doo, who lives in our world. And sometimes you get something that's completely crazy looking, like a creature that lives in our universe and has to obey our laws of physics. So it depends on the project, but whenever we start any project, we always go to reference. We always go to what is the inspiration. And once we know what the inspiration is, in what kind of a universe is it going to live? Is it going to live in our universe? Okay, so if it's a witch on a broom, she probably, or he probably has a cat that obeys our laws of physics and convinces you that that witch lives in our universe. So there's always something that grounds you in reference for where and what you are.
So it's used as a tool, but we just don't realize that. That's
right.
Very clever, very subtle. Okay, so I mean, so being involved early on in the process means that you can sort of really provide that insight. Oftentimes, I'm sure that creators come up with something and then it's more a validation of something that's been created, which is, I guess, another part of the process.
That happens sometimes, and sometimes they say, does this look good? Hoping you'll say yes. And it's not always the case. But again, the earlier the better, like reading the script, right? If you come in late at the end, you might be fixing problems, and that's expensive. And in my experience, the artists always want to get it right. But directors and producers get farther and farther and farther away from that, And sometimes they say, well, like you said, I want something that no one's ever seen before. And so the artist's like, what do you really want? And then you have to work within that context. But the earlier you are in the process, the better it is, because you can avoid pitfalls. And you can also provide ideas. I mean, the last project we worked on that was Strange World. And for spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the film, you're inside of a huge creature. And the inside of that huge creature is essentially like being in the respiratory system of a bug. Because bugs have things called trachea. They're like caves. That's how you make your way in. We got to throw that idea out before anything went into film. And that became a major theme in the film. But it wouldn't have made it into the film had we not had the chance to be there right on the early stages.
And it's interesting that you say you need to consider these things to make it believable, but not everyone is a paleontologist or has as much background, so may not be aware of what makes sense or what doesn't, but somehow when it is conveyed, it is perceived to be realistic.
Well, when we say believable, we mean, do you believe that it lives in the universe of the story we're trying to help create?
I mean, one of the things that I'm always thinking about, and that I think all creature designers think about, particularly when we have to do something that seems believable, which is more often than not, this is where you get into something that's just, I don't know, I hate to use the word spiritual, but it's where you get into an understanding that goes beyond just observation. You start to understand the rhythms of nature and nature's very style. We have to look at nature as the perfect artist. Nothing it does is wrong. Everything is right, or God, whatever you want to call it. But there is a distinct flow to nature. You can always tell when you're looking at the real thing. You know, for instance, if someone had manufactured those elk over there, or whatever they are, deer, you would probably be able to tell. Whereas them being the actual a taxidermied real thing, it simulates the look of nature flawlessly, you know, and I mean, it is nature. You're looking at the surface of it there. And this is why the hardest thing to do in sculpture and in special effects are people. You know, if you have to have a fake person that moves and talks and everything, it's probably going to be extremely difficult to make it work. I know that Stanley Kubrick, the greatest filmmaker in history, called up the greatest makeup effects artist in the world, Rick Baker, and he was getting ready to start a film called AI, which Steven Spielberg eventually made. And he asked Rick, can you make a fully mechanical, believable little boy? And Rick said, nope. It can't be done. And although Rick shot himself in the foot in terms of like, he didn't take that job with the great Stanley Kubrick, he was probably right. You know, I mean, that would be incredibly daunting and difficult. And when you see mechanical heads or people or things on film, you always kind of go, unless it's extraordinarily well done and very carefully shot.
Because there's an intuition there. It sounds like that we're in tune with nature.
Yeah, the uncanny valley thing and all that.
Absolutely.
But so when I'm designing a creature, I really think about nature's style. It has areas of rest. There are drab patterns or elaborate patterns on creature skin, depending on its size and what it does and why. And, you know, the areas that are going to be the most muscular, the areas that are going to be the most fleshy, you know, and that all comes down to understanding in an intrinsic way the way that nature designs animals, you know.
And it's interesting you should say that, because we're talking about the scientific considerations, which is tangible, but then you also brought up this spiritual side. And I mean, for creature making, evolution and functional anatomy are obviously really important. But we're talking about witches and wizards in this discussion, so I'm really interested to talk a little bit now about how the world of mythology and witchcraft and folklore and religion also inspires your practice, because that's something else that actually isn't as tangible as science, Dr. Sumida.
Well, there's this misconception that science and art are two different things, and obviously we're seeing today that they overlap. There's also a misconception that culture and science don't overlap, and they do. Construction, if you look at early art on cave walls was animals, but early art was also almost certainly body decoration and jewelry and so on. And so the same people who were considering the construction of creatures were also considering their own culture. Mm-hmm. And if you don't think that those go together, all you have to do is see how politics is impacting science these days. But one of the things that happens is that we have to take those things into consideration. I can tell you how a horse runs, okay? But if you want to know how someone rode a horse in a variety of different cultures all across the world, it's all over the map. Okay, right. We just heard today in a science report some of the earliest horsemen in Europe and what they probably put on their horses to ride. Very different from when the stirrup was invented probably in China, and very different from when the saddle was convergently designed in many other places. So culture is constantly impacting how we interact with organisms, and we are organisms. So how we dress, what we think, what we believe, and behavior. When we talk about the ebb and flow of biology and nature, behavior is part of it, and behavior and spiritual thought is just a part of that. And if you don't think about those things, then you don't have a complete world.
Absolutely.
That you're building.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you don't have a complete world to build, where do the creatures go?
That's really well put. Georgie, what are your inspirations in terms of cultural references that have influenced your work?
Well, I think that in the Western world, there's a tremendous amount of kind of blindness to how absolutely exquisite the heritage of so many countries and peoples are. You know, I was dismayed when I went to China to talk about having worked on Avatar, and there wasn't there was a major language barrier, and they would say, oh, you know, and I'd be like, okay, and then all of a sudden I was on a talk show. It was very strange. Like, they said, okay, we're going here now, and it's like, all right, and it's like, okay, you go. And I'm like, they mic'd me up and everything. I was like, all of a sudden I'm on stage, and there was a huge crowd of people in cosplay, and they were asking me, one of the questions was, why can't the Chinese make anything as cool as Avatar?
Oh, wow, okay.
And I was really dismayed by that question. I thought, your culture is 10,000 times more elaborate, deep, long, and older. Just older. Yeah, I mean, rich than Western culture. I mean, granted, I mean, you know, European things go back thousands of years, but I mean, the dynasties of China, the culture, the clothing, the food, you know, I mean, not just China, but Asia in general. I mean, there are these 9-year-old girls that learn these dances, and every movement means something, and it's just incredible. And I said, why aren't you looking at your own cultures as a place to start. Don't worry about what James Cameron is doing. This is all made up stuff, mostly ripped off from Native Americans, the story of Native Americans. And they seemed perplexed, and I was like, and I feel the same way about African culture, particularly Nigeria and areas like that, is so incredible. And I was always fascinated as a little kid with Greek mythology and with Egypt and with African culture. My mother used to hang African masks on the wall, to remind us of our African heritage, and she would hang them on the wall. And I was fascinated by the economy of form used to create expressions, and so I take into account a great deal of world cultures, particularly when I'm designing alien stuff, of course, because it's such an incredibly rich tapestry that humankind has come up with. I mean, I could go on and on.
Well, that was a great, because I was going to say, I'm Nigerian, and in the Yoruba culture, witchcraft is weaved in so much into the culture, and the masks and the stories behind that. It's real culture that you can then draw on. A follow-up question to that is, with witches and wizards and magic, they have grown in popularity in recent years. What comes to mind? Harry Potter, and I know, Stuart, you worked on the first and the last Harry Potter movie. But actually, these are real things. They're not fantasy. For many people, it's a way of life. So I'm wondering how you kind of deal with that reality in creating these narratives.
Well, you both said something really important, the word narrative and story, right? None of this is interesting if the story is no good, and you just heard, like, these masks and these sculptures, each of them tells a story, or there's a narrative, or if we talk about magic, there's a reason why the magic is important. There's a cultural reason behind it, okay? And so, of course, now with the Potter films and so on, what's happened is that there's an entire community that's grown up with it and enhanced it. And whenever you step into that world, you have your feet in two different places. You have your foot in a magical world, but you have your foot in a magical world that's also familiar. Okay, I know they're set in the UK, but they're set in our world, right? And so you have to believe that Harry's wand works in our world, so that when he uses it, rocks fall the way they fall in our world if, say, he breaks down the stone wall. When an owl flies and brings in the mail, it's got to look like an owl. It can't look like something else. Okay? Now, Dumbledore's phoenix is a mythical animal, but the feathers have to look like feathers. So, and when he moves his wings or his tail, they have to obey the physics of our world for you to believe in the magic that could live in our world as well. And so it's a tightrope that's actually really tough to walk. People say, oh, is life of pi hard? Yes, it's hard to make something look perfectly real. But we're not trying to make you live in two worlds. We're only trying to make you live in one. But when we talk about magic, we're trying to get you to live in two worlds at the same time. And that's not an easy task. And it takes, we're each one individual. And when we work on a film, we're talking about crews of hundreds of people that all have to interact and have that same goal.
And play their role in making sure that goal is achieved.
It's like the world's biggest co-authored paper. I know all the scientists got that one. So.
Geordie, you've said previously that imbuing your creatures in some human element is very important. And you had mentioned before, like, creating this boy was such a challenge. So you're making the audience comfortable with the world that you've created, which seems to be a theme throughout in this season, which is rule making and integrity. To what extent do you think that the creatures that you create actually reflect our humanity? because we as humans are creating them. And how relevant would you say then is like representation and our own biases in that process? Have you come up against that in your work?
Well, if I understand the question, basically, I mean, I have a book that I sell on my website about creature design. I've got 2 volumes. One is about mask making, how I make masks. But the first one is basically how to design creatures. You know, they're only $5. But these books,
Bargain.
but in the book, the first one, I talk very specifically about the elements of creature design. And one of the elements is the human touch. Basically, it's important not to anthropomorphize your creature, because I really don't like that. Unless you're doing something like a cartoon, like Mickey Mouse or something like that, you don't want to anthropomorphize your monster. And give it sort of cutesy traits that we all kind of recognize. You know, people are always projecting. We can't help it. We're projecting on animals all the time. And, when a chimpanzee does this, it's not smiling.
Oh no,
It's
no,
showing
I've seen
you.
some documentaries.
In fact, when a dog does this, it's the same thing. It's saying, I can bite you with these, back off. And chimps, that's called the fear grin, that face. That means it's afraid and it's showing you these, I'm going to use these if you don't back off. So, we look at certain animals as cute and certain animals as ugly and scary, but because we can't help but have this anthropomorphized connotation about them. So I think when I'm designing, it's always important to have there be some element of the creature that is relatable to humans. Even if it's a completely bizarre thing like the adult creature in Alien, it still has that mouth full of chrome teeth, which in 1979, I was 13, and I begged my parents to see it. Please let me see it. I said, Dad, what's it like? What's it like? What's it like? What's it like? He was like, I don't know. It's sort of like a crab, and then it's like a snake, and then it's like a big, gorilla. And I thought, you had me till gorilla. That sounds really bad. And when I saw the film, finally, I begged my parents enough to let me see it, with a little note for the ticketeer. We allow our son to see,
Warm down.
But it did not look like a gorilla to me. It looked like some sort of horrible, horrible nightmare. Some slinky, wet machine. But it has...
Horrible in a great way.
Well, I think the best way.
Yeah.
But it had that mouth that was very expressive. And the face hugger itself, the thing that jumps on the original person in the film, is modeled essentially after the human hand, which is the second most expressive part of our body. The face is the most, and then immediately following it is the hand. You can say anger, relaxed, fear, stop, all kinds of things. So the dexterity of the hand is a very expressive thing. But in summation, essentially, yes, I think imbuing your creature with some element of humanity is important to give the audience something to connect with and something to make it even more fearsome, I think.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to audience questions soon, but just a quick follow-up question. I think in thinking of witches and wizards in that world and how they are kind of more human, it's always like the things around them that tend to be either, based on some homogenous collection of creature features or something completely made up.
I don't quite understand that.
So with witches are humans, witches are real, but then the creatures surrounding them, like Stuart was talking about earlier, like the owl has to be realistic in order for us to believe. But in the context of what you were just saying, like that human element, does that leave room for then these supportive creatures to then be not so human?
I suppose. For instance, I think one of the things about Harry Potter and the creatures in Lord of the Rings and all this sort of thing, all these fantasy films, we've got so much fantasy now, more than ever before. They tried fantasy out over and over again in the 70s and the 80s, and it just failed. Dragon Slayer, Willow, The Dark Crystal, which was a masterpiece, but it didn't do well. Labyrinth,
Dave.
and it wasn't catching on. Krull, and then in the 2000s, it's had this massive resurgence. What was the question again?
So hold that thought. I thought the audience have a bunch of questions. So since it's time for the Q&A, we'll transition to that. But
Sorry.
talk about it.
I just lost my thread.
I was into it.
That was a tricky one that I threw out there. Thank you both. So just a note, the Natural History Museum staff are coming around with microphones, so just raise your hands and they'll come find you. I think we have a question over on the left.
Hello. Has the emerging field of genetic engineering, we're getting a lot more better at, has that changed how you approach your work at all? Or, anyone, yeah.
Well, okay. So one of the things that we're doing with genetic engineering is we're not going to the extremes that you're seeing in film. So so we're doing things like we're making plants with pesticide resistance. We're making things that can hopefully grow in drought conditions and things like that. But building creatures out of multiple parts is not something we're capable of doing yet. And in fact, right before we came in here, I was asked, have you ever been to Comic-Con? And the answer is yes. And one of the questions we got at Comic-Con was like, what's wrong with Jurassic Park? And the dinosaurs are great. And you know what the answer was? You couldn't genetically build a locust that could do that. You couldn't. Because every time you do something like that and introduce it into nature willy-nilly, it's a disaster. Okay? So we do genetic engineering. It is coming along, and in our lifetimes it will probably benefit us, but to create creatures out of parts that didn't already exist in their own genome, highly unlikely above the level of bacteria. But bacteria are important, okay? And so are viruses, but we'll talk about pandemics later.
We have a question back here.
Hi.
Yes, here.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not looking at you.
Sorry. Hi. So Jordan, you were talking earlier about how you envision nature as something perfect, and that got me thinking, because as a biologist, actually what I find the most fascinating about nature is how many mistakes there are, but still everything works in such an amazing way. And for example, our back pain is just this mistake that comes from us standing up in 2 feet, and it sucks having back pain, but look how much we accomplish as a species just by standing up and being able to look far enough. So I'd like to redirect this question to Stuart, actually, as a paleontologist. Do you have a favorite mistake in nature?
That's a great question.
Okay, just before we got here, I was telling Dr. Pierce that I need to have a complete knee replacement in May. Yeah, human knees suck. Okay. Okay, but here's the thing, and my students, and when I teach, especially introductory level students, or people who doubt evolution, they say, well, how come we still get colds? And how come, and back pain's a classic example, right? Because of our orthograde posture. And the answer is that evolution isn't about perfection. Evolution is a series of trade-offs. So when we stood up, we have cruddy knees and bad backs, but it allowed us, and they think I'm gonna say make tools, but I'm not. I'm going to say it allowed us to carry babies. Where do women put the babies?
Yeah.
On their hips, right?
Yeah.
Humans walk really well, and we covered the planet, not with tools, carrying our babies, gentlemen, save the mothers. But the answer, I think, is that evolution is a series of trade-offs, and those trade-offs are amazing and wonderful. So a peacock is having those feathers is a really stupid idea. But if it lets him have baby peacocks, then he wins, right? So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. I might be visible to a predator. I might have bad knees, but the trade-off makes it worth it. So evolution is about a series of trade-offs, is the way I like to think of it. So.
Nicely put. Okay, we have a question just at the back there.
Okay, sorry. Hi. So somebody was talking earlier about this idea that the creatures you create have to be believable and people have to accept them. And I was thinking about the fact that, not as a rule, but very often when we see sentient, intelligent like creatures, they tend to have some sort of humanoid structure. We a lot of times see them walking upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, maybe just like in the new Ant-Man. He was a broccoli man. You haven't seen that there's a broccoli man in Ant-Man, but he's still walking upright. So I guess my question was, when you're thinking of creating a creature that is supposed to be portrayed as like the intelligent, sentient creature, what thought goes into how to make that believable? Do you think that any creature form could be conveyed that way? Like you could turn anything into being a believable sentient creature, or is there a certain thought process that goes into it?
So much of it depends on what the character does in the film or show. A lot of it is dependent on its character and how it interacts with others that reveals intelligence or caring or malevolence or whatever it is. One of the classic traits of alien intellect has always been a large cranium to show that the brain has evolved to a very large point where the cranium is big. And that's something that I think makes sense. It makes biological sense. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have brain texture on the outside of the head like the Metaluna mutant or something, but to have a large cranium makes sense to me. For it to have some kind of, again, we get into here what I call parallel evolution, which is the concept to me that things on other planets are going to evolve not as the same, but similarly to the way they've evolved here, i.e. 2 eyes for bifocal vision, 2 eyes for depth and to see at all. We have 2 eyes so that we can perceive depth. We've got mouths to communicate and, of course, to take in sustenance, to reject sustenance if we're sick. So I tend to design creatures that have elements of that thought process going on.
So that's, okay, heads are important. Well, one, okay, for a variety of reasons. One, first of all, producers and directors need you to be able to relate to a character, and eyes are important. As you just heard, hands come in second place, but faces are hugely important. Now, why do animals have heads? Any active animal has to perceive its environment, and it usually puts its sensory apparatus on the front end so it knows where it's going. So noses probably came first to sense chemicals in the environment, ears and eyes, so you know where you're going. So any active thing that processes information from its environment has a processing thing, a brain, and sensory apparatus. So heads and faces are probably really important no matter what planet you're on. That being said, how many Star Trek fans out there? Okay, Original Star Trek. The Horda, a rock creature. Who knows what's out there? That as long as there's enough neural tissue in there, it might not look like what we have. So I thought believe it or not, that was my favorite creature from the original Star Trek, because it allowed for a little bit of creativity, and it was a little bit out of there. It wasn't just someone painted green. So, no. But yeah, you need a head. You need a head and a brain. So.
Thank you. That was our last question.
That was our last question.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for joining tonight's discussion. Let's give a round of applause to our incredible guests. Thank you to our guest speakers, Dr. Stuart Samida and Geordie Shao.